By 1944, Erwin Rommel was a legend, the desert fox, admired by German troops and respected by his enemies. But within months of the Normandy landings, he would vanish, just a sudden announcement and a funeral. For decades, the truth was buried. But what really happened to Rommel would slowly surface, revealing a dark and complicated end to one of Germany's most famous military leaders. This is his story. Let's first explain his war journey and what led to such dark events halfway into the Second World War. Erwin Rommel's path to command didn't begin among the military aristocracy. He was born in 1891 as the son of a schoolteacher. He entered the army before the First World War and earned a reputation the hard way, in the trenches and through direct combat. During the Great War, he was wounded multiple times and was even awarded the Pour le Mérite for his leadership. His soldiers followed him because of it. Some years later, in 1939, came the Second World War, and Rommel was appointed commander of Hitler's personal escort battalion during the invasion of Poland. That role placed him in close proximity to the German leadership, especially Hitler himself. Because of earned trust, he was given command of the 7th Panzer Division during the 1940 invasion of France. During that campaign, his unit moved with such unpredictability that Allied intelligence called it the Ghost Division. Rommel was using aggressive tactics that would define his reputation, relying on momentum, pressure, and fast decision-making to overwhelm French and British forces. It worked. That success brought him a new assignment in North Africa. In early 1941, Rommel arrived in Libya to take over the battered Italian-German forces facing the British 8th Army. Within just weeks of his arrival, he launched a bold counter-offensive that recaptured key territory and reversed a long series of Axis defeats. His use of fast armored strikes and tactical deception earned him respect on both sides of the war, and Allied troops quickly learned his name. Erwin Rommel became a legend, earning the Desert Fox nickname from the Allies and becoming a national icon back home. But behind those victories, deeper problems were building. His forces had been stretched to the breaking point. Fuel and ammunition arrived too late or not at all, and Berlin rarely listened when he warned that the situation was slipping out of control. After early triumphs, his Africa Corps was steadily pushed back across the desert, worn down by Allied air superiority, broken supply lines, and impossible orders. Orders from Berlin more often made no strategic sense. Every attempt to shift tactics was delayed, blocked, or denied. His frustration slowly grew to the point that, quietly, Rommel began to question whether Germany's real problem was the enemy or its own leadership. That tension lingered. However, the Africa Corps was beaten badly, and the North African campaign ended. Rommel was then assigned to Italy for a brief time, but soon after, he received a much more important task, probably the most important he had ever been given, and the one where he would allegedly lose his life. At least that was the story for years. But there is much more before that. By the spring of 1944, Rommel was fortifying the western coast of France against a looming Allied invasion. Hitler gave him a new title, Inspector of the Atlantic Wall. It sounded authoritative, but in practice, Rommel found himself once again battling with the delusions of German high command. The coastline defenses were a mess, with no unified plan. Rommel understood very well what was coming, having seen firsthand how Allied air power, naval guns, and logistics could overwhelm a position that was not ready. He was trying to correct what he could, laying mines, reinforcing bunkers, flooding lowlands, and creating obstacles that would slow down an amphibious assault. But as always, the Allies were not his only enemy. He could not agree with Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander of the Western Front. Von Rundstedt believed the German armored divisions should be held inland, ready to launch a massive counterattack once the invasion site was confirmed. Rommel disagreed. He argued the panzer units needed to be placed closer to the coast, ready to counterattack the moment the Allies landed and push them back into the sea. Both men had valid arguments. However, that disagreement probably led to the worst possible outcome. Some armored divisions were placed too far from the beaches to respond quickly. Others were too close and got destroyed by air and naval bombardment when the invasion finally began. No one had full control, and no one could move without direct approval from Berlin. Rommel knew this fractured command structure would cost them dearly, and he was right. When D-Day came on the morning of June 6th, Rommel was returning from a brief visit home. The initial confusion played out exactly as he had feared. Hitler refused to immediately release the armoured reserves, convinced Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Those lost hours gave the Allies a secure beachhead. Rommel raced back to the front. Despite isolated counterattacks, like the 21st Panzer Division pushing briefly to the coast near Sword and Juno beaches, German forces could not mount a coordinated response. airstrikes hammered their columns, and Allied troops were pouring in faster than anyone expected. In private, Rommel was furious. The disaster unfolding in Normandy was a failure of leadership and coordination. He began to say so more openly, especially to those closest to him, but as his frustration deepened, others were already taking bolder steps. Those steps would soon drag Rommel into a very different kind of war. At first, Rommel voiced his anger in private. He spoke cautiously to senior officers about the futility of continuing the war under Hitler's command. But as casualties mounted, those conversations shifted and turned into quiet agreement that something had to change. And Rommel was not the only one thinking it. His new chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, was already connected to the growing resistance network. It was Speidel who introduced Rommel to General Karl Heinrich, the military governor of Paris and one of the key players in the anti-Hitler conspiracy. The men met discreetly, choosing their words carefully. Rommel made it clear he did not support assassination. He believed Hitler should be arrested and tried, not executed, as he feared that could plunge Germany into civil war. Still, Rommel kept his focus mostly on the battlefield. His priority was stopping the destruction of German forces in Normandy, but Hitler was making that increasingly more difficult to do, with his no-step-back policies and orders to fight till the last man fanatically. But then, two shocking things would happen in just a 3-day span that would change literally everything. On July 17th, Rommel was on his way back from a meeting, driving in his open-top staff car. However, he was spotted by an Allied fighter aircraft, and the pilot recognized it as a German command vehicle. That made it a highly prized target. The fighter dived and strafed the car with autocannons and machine guns. Rommel's driver was hit and killed. Rommel, sitting just inches beside him in the front seat, was either thrown or jumped out of the vehicle as it veered out of control. He hit the ground hard and suffered multiple skull fractures, facial wounds, and a concussion. He was rushed to a field hospital, then evacuated to Germany, somehow surviving despite the incredibly small odds. And while Rommel was lying in a hospital bed, 3 days later, something far more shocking would happen. But this time, not because of Allied action. At Hitler's remote headquarters in East Prussia, his inner circle gathered for what looked like a routine military briefing. But beneath the table was a briefcase packed with explosives. It had been placed there by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated officer who had lost his right hand and an eye fighting in North Africa. And now he was placing everything on the line to take Hitler down. He slipped the case under the heavy oak table, made an excuse, and walked out. Minutes later, it detonated. The explosion tore through the conference room and killed 4 men instantly. News spread that the Führer was dead, and Operation Valkyrie was already in motion to seize control of the government. However, a crucial mistake had already been made. Hitler was not dead. He had been shielded by the thick wooden table leg that absorbed most of the blast. Miraculously, and perhaps frustratingly for the conspirators, the Führer was very much alive, and now he was enraged. As the Gestapo moved in to crush the resistance, interrogations began. When we say interrogations, we mean even if you knew nothing, you would say something just to make your execution arrive faster. Names were given up, and one of those names was Erwin Rommel. That was more than enough to raise suspicion at the highest levels, and now the regime had questions and plans of its own. As Rommel recovered at home in Ulm, there were no public charges against him. No Gestapo interrogators came knocking, and no formal accusation had been made. But behind closed doors, decisions were already being made. Hitler was convinced Rommel had betrayed him. Yet he couldn't just execute him like the others in the fanatical purge that followed the assassination attempt. The problem was that Rommel was a national hero. Putting him on trial would have been a public relations disaster, so they chose a different path, one that was quiet, and so secretive that for years the real truth would not come out. On October 14, 1944, 2 officers arrived at Rommel's home. General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Ernst Meisel came bearing an offer. You could call it that, but it was not really a choice. Rommel was given 3 options. First, he could travel to Berlin and defend himself before Hitler. Even they admitted this would quite certainly end with his execution. Second, he could face trial in the People's Court. This way, not only would he die, but his wife and son would be arrested and his legacy destroyed. Or third, the most appealing option. He could end it himself and let the generals take care of the rest. If he chose this option, his family would be spared, his reputation would remain intact, and he would receive a state funeral. The official story would be that he had died from complications related to his war wounds, and he would remain a national hero, going out in fashion. Rommel did not take long to decide. He asked for time to say goodbye to his wife and son. He explained to them calmly what was about to happen, telling them he never betrayed Germany, but that this was the way it had to be, that it was best for all. Waiting by the car was a uniformed SS driver. Rommel gave one last glance back at his house, where his wife and teenage son stood watching. He climbed into the back seat, and the car drove off into the countryside. A few kilometers outside the city, the driver pulled off the road and stopped. There, in the silence, Bergdorf turned to Rommel and handed him a small glass vial. Rommel took it in his hand and bit down. Minutes later, the car pulled up to a nearby military hospital, and Rommel was carried inside. 10 minutes later, his wife was told by telephone that her husband had died suddenly from complications related to his injuries in Normandy. The story made headlines. A national day of mourning was declared. Newspapers praised his courage. A state funeral was held, complete with eulogies, lowered flags, and of course carefully crafted lies. But within a few years, the full picture slowly began to emerge. It turned out Rommel had been far closer to the anti-Hitler resistance than the public ever knew. He had met with key conspirators months before the July plot, where they discussed the possibility of ending the war in the West and removing Hitler from power. It is said that Rommel opposed assassination, but him being in those rooms with those people was enough to seal his fate. If Hitler had stood just 1 foot to the side, everything might have looked completely different, but we could never know. As for the men involved in Rommel's quiet execution, General Bergdorf shot himself in Hitler's bunker in May 1945, just hours before Soviet troops arrived. General Meisel survived the war and lived in West Germany until 1978, while the fate of the SS driver who oversaw Rommel's last moments remains unclear.